Welcome to American Pulse. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. President Danielo Turk, the former president of Slovenia. Mr. President has been not only a diplomat, not only a politician, but also a professor in the university. Welcome to the show.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much for your time, and thanks for making this happen.
Well, my pleasure, as I said.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, I wanted to know, first of all, I would like to introduce you to my viewership. You've been the former president of Slovenia. If you don't mind, if you can elaborate on your resume and your CV.
Well, I could describe myself in a way as a son of the United Nations, because I have worked with the United Nations since my teenage years. I was a member and later president of an association of UN youth clubs that we had in Slovenia at that time, which was a pretty large movement. I was always interested in the United Nations. Actually, my first recollection dates back to the times of Dag Hammarskjöld. I was listening to the radio programs, and I was very excited about what Dag Hammarskjöld was doing. Now later, after having completed my studies, I became interested in the issues of ethnic minorities and human rights, and became a member of various committees in the United Nations as an expert. At that time I was a junior academic, so to speak. I also drafted a declaration on the right to development back in 1986, which was adopted in 86. And then when Slovenia became an independent state, I was asked by my government to represent a new country in the United Nations. So I came to New York with my family, established myself, started to worked very closely with a number of great diplomats of that era, including the ambassador of Egypt, Nabil El Arabi, who later was foreign minister and the secretary general of the Arab League, and many others. Then I was on the Security Council representing Slovenia in 98, 99. And then Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of that time, invited me to join the Secretariat as his assistant for political affairs. So I was working with the member states, with the Secretariat, Secretary General, on a variety of political issues at that time. I went back home in 2005 to write a book about international law, which I practiced for previous 13 years, and also to do some teaching. And then I was invited to run for the presidency. I became president. I finished my term. And then
2007 to 2012,
exactly,
right?
Yes. And when I finished my term, very soon after, some friends from East European countries were starting to ask me, why don't I present my candidature as candidate for the post of the UN Secretary General.
Yes.
And that I did in a new procedure which has been adopted last year by the General Assembly. And according to that procedure, the government has to nominate candidates. Previously, this was done much
The governments of each country has to nominate their...
national. Yeah,
correct.
That's the understanding which...
Just I'm trying to explain in details for my viewership how this comes about. Like, why would they pick somebody from Eastern Europe versus Africa versus Asia?
Well, the tradition and the kind of an unwritten rule in the United Nations is that the candidates for such posts, not only for this one, for the Secretary General, but for most or for all posts in the UN, are rotating. In other words, there are 5 regional groups, and rotation is necessary in order to ensure a degree of fairness.
Silence democracy, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And those regional groups are African countries, Asian countries, Latin American countries, and then Western Europe and Eastern Europe.
Yes.
So these are the regional groups which rotate. And the East European group is the only one which hasn't contributed the Secretary General of the United Nations as yet. There have been Secretaries General from Europe, from Asia, from Latin America, from Africa, but not from East Europe. So that has given rise to those discussions. And then friends from the diplomatic circles thought that I would be an appropriate candidate. Our government, the government of Slovenia, nominated me in February this year, and then we went through a process of so-called informal dialogues, a form of hearing before the General Assembly in April, and in the Security Council in June. And after that, there were such ideas as, well, should we go to the straw polling? In other words, an indicative vote to figure out how different candidates stand, how much support they have in the Security Council. This process has started in July.
Okay.
And will continue now throughout August, September, October, possibly longer. But certainly it will not be finished before, I think, second half of October.
So the nomination or the picking of the Secretary General would be through the votes of the rest of the countries in the Security Council?
Well, the Security Council, according to the Charter, makes the nomination of one candidate whom they select from the entire number.
So now we have like 11, if I'm not mistaken.
Now there are 11 candidates.
Correct.
And once the process of the Security Council is completed, it has to be completed with an agreement on one candidate. That candidate is then proposed to the General Assembly, and General Assembly decides.
Right.
So as you can see, it's a process which takes quite a while. It takes almost a year now, according to the procedure that's currently valid. And I believe that it's a wise thing to have. I mean, to have a preliminary phase, one where candidates come to the General Assembly, address the issues and answer questions. For example, I got around 40 questions when we had this discussion on 13 April this year, and 2 hours in which 40 questions had to be answered. You can imagine.
And these are formal hearings or informal?
Well, they are informal in the sense that there are no records, formal records or any formality.
It just gives the audience probably a feeling what
Exactly.
is the candidate is about, where is your areas of strengths, and what are the areas that you can come in and help out. And
But then you have to understand that the audience in this case are representatives of 193 member states. This is not an academic audience or audience of people who are generally interested in international affairs. These are decision makers. These are people representing governments. And once the process of these hearings is over, the membership has an idea about the strengths and weaknesses of each candidate. And that, of course, is relevant for the Security Council, because the Council has to be aware of the impression that candidates have made already in the General Assembly, and that influences their own analysis and decision before they come to the conclusion as to who would be the most appropriate candidate. Now, I have come into this question with some procedural details, and I apologize to our viewers if this sounded too technical, too procedural, but this is how things are in the United Nations.
I have done a little bit of research, and I've been watching what's happening in this, and I know that you are very strongly accepted and acknowledged by a lot of the representatives. And this is something that it's really good, and we know that you have a very high chance of winning the Secretary of General Assembly. So how do you feel about that?
Well, first of all, I'm glad that you see things this way. I believe that member states have generally appreciated that my experience is really helpful. I mean, I have worked for many years with the United Nations, within the United Nations, as a government representative, as a secretariat member, on various issues, security, development, human rights. In other words, people who are watching my performance and who are watching my background would know what my record is. I'm not theorizing about things.
You've put it on the ground. People saw your work.
Exactly. And therefore, this has helped. Now, in the decisions of who should be the Secretary General, the decisions in the Security Council and the General Assembly, there is obviously a variety of political factors, political motivations, expectations, and so forth. So I shouldn't be too certain about my performance being equally appreciated by everybody. As you can imagine, countries have different concerns, different visions, different ideas.
Circumstances going on in the world now, and this is where I was going with my next question.
Yes,
Do you think the role of the UN today is similar to the UN role 10 years ago, 15 years ago?
No, I think the world has become more complex. The questions of peace and security are more difficult, more complicated, more diverse, and less based solely on states. I mean, there is a wide variety of non-state actors, as we say. Now, this is a deceptively benevolent term, non-state actors. Very often we have to deal with terrorists, we have to deal with extremists.
It's becoming a fact now.
And this is becoming a fact of very large proportions. There was a time when this sort of phenomena were limited to small numbers of so-called non-state actors in countries who were particularly affected by terrorism and extremism. But now this has gone much wider, and the UN as an intergovernmental body doesn't have an easy time to figure out what would work and how to organize activities for peace and security in these new circumstances. So one has to understand that the UN is challenged differently today, and it would have to be not only more active, but more innovative in its approach to these security challenges. I'm mentioning this as a very dramatic and very fundamental example of the new realities in which we live.
I know that you're a very well-talented politician and diplomat, so I might not get a straight answer in this question,
Yes.
but what would you do different from what's happening now in the UN towards the Middle East?
Now, I think that one of the unfortunate developments has been that given the number and complexity of issues in the region, the central issue, the most fundamental issue, the issue of Palestine, hasn't been given appropriate attention and appropriate political creativity to deal with it. Of course, there were initiatives in the past, but now for a number of years, nothing much has happened.
You're dying out.
Exactly. One can understand the reasons, but one should not be satisfied with that. So how to go about it? Not everything has to be done anew. I think the two-state solution continues to be the fundamental approach, irrespective of all the difficulties that we have seen. And I think that the Arab League's peace plan of 2002 provides the best available framework for the solution of this fundamental problem. Now, of course, it will be important to ensure that this problem comes back to the forefront of the agenda, which is currently not the case, unfortunately.
Yes.
And one has to do some really serious diplomatic work to bring that change about. And this is, of course, not simple, because right now we see the situation in Syria, we see the situation in Libya, in Yemen, and these are enormously difficult and complicating factors. Nevertheless, I think the vision and the approach to be taken should be based on the acceptance of centrality of Palestinian issue and of the need to move forward towards a two-state solution.
ISIS?
Well, ISIS is obviously a relatively new phenomenon, and of course we could have a special discussion on the origins, the phenomenology, the whole ideology, the specific character of this new phenomenon. But then again, I think the most important thing politically would be to really ensure an agreement among states in the region and global players on a sufficiently detailed policy towards ISIS. Now, everybody is affected now. In Europe, we have seen...
Every day, every week, we hear something.
I'm mentioning Europe not only because I'm coming from Europe, but because Europe has had the tendency in the past to see things in a kind of a regionally limited context. Say, well, you know, these are problems that appear in the Middle East and will have to be resolved in
They only watch it on TV.
Yeah. Now, and of course, TV... I say this with some humility to a TV person like you. TV has this unusual effect of making people familiar with problems without making them encouraged to do something about problems.
I agree.
And here we have a fundamental challenge for politicians in countries and for diplomacy to figure out what the right policy would be. Now, some of things that have to be done are pretty obvious but not easily doable. For example, a more coherent cooperation among intelligence services of states. We have seen even in Europe, in the European Union, which is a very highly integrated group of states, that the recent difficulties, attacks were revealed deficiencies in cooperation among security, miscommunication. Now, one can be surprised that that is the case, but it's much more important to understand that this is a very fundamental problem which states can resolve and should resolve in the future. It's not an easy one. It requires a higher level of trust than we currently have, but it is a necessity of our era. We are talking about sovereign states, of course, but sovereignty nowadays means responsibility. And responsibility means responsibility for collective action. So much more needs to be done in the information sharing, in organizing appropriate collective action to confront, to confront and to defeat the phenomena such as ISIS.
Before I jump to another topic, do you think, and I know I never like to cry over spilled milk, but, just for us to learn for the future,
yes,
so there's no other phenomenons like ISIS that would grow in the region. Do you think we took it lightly and we did not take the proper steps to stop them from growing at the time where we could, and now it's almost cancerous and it's metastasizing all over the place?
Well, I will go in further. I think that the emergence of ISIS has to do with the entire experience of Iraq after 2003. And that, of course, is one of very major problems which, happened in the past, in the recent past, and has been a major contributing factor to this phenomenon that is now becoming almost uncontrollable.
And it happened in Afghanistan, and it's happening in Iraq, and in Syria.
See, in Afghanistan, I believe one realized the nature of that mistake in the 1980s and also in the 90s. There were two different eras in which the extremism was perhaps taken too benevolently, or perhaps even sometimes stimulated for political gains. But then again, we knew that. And after September 11, I think the world was in a good position to concentrate its action in Afghanistan, invest properly, organize international cooperation around the support to new Afghan authorities which were starting to emerge after the year 2002. And I still believe that we could have made much more progress in Afghanistan had the war in Iraq not happened in 2003. So you see, the problem has been understood and has started earlier, but became different, became much more monstrous as a result of 2003 and subsequent developments. So your analysis is correct, and I just wanted to go a step further and say, okay, we know also where the origins are, what the mistakes were. Let us not unnecessarily complicate our discussions with who is to blame, but let us see how do we cooperate now so that we prevent further spreading or further phenomena like this.
Do you think and this is a topic, honestly, I'm very I have mixed feelings to the refugee situation. I have mixed feelings. I know that we need to support them. We need to know we need to help them, but at the same time, look who we bring in. How can we make a right decision?
Well, this is a very good question, and I think that the right decisions are not easy to make for several reasons. First, the phenomenon has become so large and so overwhelming that it is much more difficult to deal with now than it was several years ago. One has to understand that magnitude brings a totally new quality of problems. And of course, if one takes again the example of Europe, Europe has now realized that its systems, which were developed to deal more or less with individuals or small groups of refugees or people who need to go to Europe, that system simply is not adequate. Something else has to be established, and that something else is very slow in coming. I'm just mentioning one
So like
segment.
a filter kind of thing? Or?
Well, that also there should be assistance kind of thing. There should be also peacemaking kind of things. Wars have to be stopped, and so forth. Conditions have to be created to stop the flows and to allow returns. That's one aspect. But then when it comes to the refugees themselves, when it comes to the unfortunate people who have no choice but to leave, how does one help them? I mean, not only in terms of survival and most basic medical assistance, but education of children, extremely important, especially when it comes to larger refugee populations, and productive employment. Because many of the problems that result from refugee flows have to do with the absence of productive employment. If you have a family in a camp where parents don't have
And they live on a welfare, they get paid just to be there.
Yes, this is not good socially because the social fabric disintegrates, the authority of parents disintegrates, the children don't have a future. I mean, we know that there are generations now who didn't have proper education and couldn't find a way forward. So I think the magnitude of these problems now is such that we have to deal with them in a new fashion, and the UN is really only at the beginning because UN has not been involved in large population movements except through refugee assistance, but that was very limited, humanitarian. The problem, however, has social and economic dimensions and political dimensions, which states earlier on wanted to deal with themselves. They said, okay, we are a sovereign country, we'll decide whom we take. Once we take a number of people, we'll decide how they should be integrated. And of course, this was a national sort of politics that defined the attitude. Now we need a much more international approach and much more sharing of experience, information experience. Now, how does one give a productive opportunity to these people? I mean, there are studies made, and there are countries in which some efforts are being made. For example, in Jordan, where there are huge refugee populations, some of whom may be given a better opportunity in the camps. Now, those who have somehow integrated in the Jordanian society have at least taken care of some of their problems, but some of them stay in camps. And they also have to be given productive opportunity and proper education for the children. That requires money, obviously, but money in itself is not enough. We also need investment. And that investment has to be designed so that it has a productive function and theoretically at least allows for returns once the conditions in neighboring Syria become peaceful.
Did you face any of these problems while you were the official president of Slovenia between 2007 and 2012?
At that time, these problems were not of the same magnitude. But look, I mean, we in Slovenia had this experience in the 90s when war broke out in Bosnia. We had around 70,000 refugees from Bosnia coming to Slovenia and staying with Slovenians for several years. And at that time, Slovenia is 2 million people. Imagine the proportions of population. But that was more manageable because people knew each other, they were relatives, and in the neighboring areas, it's easier to find a way forward. My mother, for example, who lived in a small apartment, took two friends, women with small children from Croatia, where there was war. And, they said, look, I mean, this is not a situation where we can leave children to live in this kind of circumstances of armed conflict. So why don't you come, we'll, squeeze into a small apartment, we'll be together and we'll figure out what to do. There was a lot of that, and that's easier when you have people who are from the neighboring areas where cultural distinctions practically don't exist, where they may be from family ties or friendships or otherwise, it's easier. Now, of course, the flows go much further from the immediate areas of conflict, and that makes the whole integration process much more difficult because people have to learn about each other. And for refugees, of course, this is not only a question of their immediate survival and their basic human rights. It's also a question of how do they find their place in the legal system where they are, respectful rule of law, and making sure that the majority population, that the domestic population develops an appropriate confidence. How does one make sure that the linguistic skills develop in an appropriate way, not for too long? For children, that's relatively easy. You put them in schools and they learn the language very quickly. Correct. But for the adults, it's more difficult. And then, once again, the productive purpose. Because people want to work. Work is not only a means for survival. Work is, as Pope Francis said, the basis of dignity and status in a society, and that's much more difficult to arrange in a place which is further away from home. This takes time. It's not easy. Integration generally has proven to be a difficult task. And the UN hasn't been too active in this because the member states wanted that to be kept within their sovereign rights.
Sometimes we hear announcements from the UN declaring being unpleased about certain situations in certain countries. Meanwhile, there are people being beheaded in in Lebanon, in Iraq, and Syria, and we just don't hear much. And I mean, from the humanitarian rights point of view, how do we really grab onto the real problems, and do we give attention more to certain things, or should we divide the attention between all the topics at the same time? Who decides what do we talk about today? What do you think?
Yes, well, there is no single or simple question to this. I think the basic approach that I believe we should think about is there is no order in the world without sovereign states. But sovereignty has to be seen as responsibility. So the UN should be there to help states to be responsible sovereign states. That sometimes means critique, but not always. One has to be very careful about the effects of criticism, because it's easy to take an emotional approach and be outraged by certain phenomena, certain problems that exist. But one kind of always has to think, well, what kind of effect are we producing by this? What kind of help does the UN produce by being critical? And it's never going to be easy, because a degree of selectivity creeps in very easily. I mean, not every problem is considered or is discussed in the United Nations. So there's always a feeling that, all right, UN is worried about a certain problem, but not about another problem in another country. One has to be really very careful in designing a policy which would demonstrate that UN can be objective.
Yes. And I was trying to lead the question to Egypt.
Yes.
So let's take a look at Egypt. 5 years ago was ruled by the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yes.
Came in, President Sisi took him out, and the army took him out of, and the will of the people, 35 million people in the streets, took him out of the office.
Yes.
Finally got a government that almost everybody wants. Let's say 90% of the people wanted President Sisi to be in the office. And we've seen some resistance from certain countries and lack of support from the UN in certain occasions. I can't generalize, because some occasions the UN were supportive, but in certain, when it comes to the national security and came to trying to get the country together and trying to apply the law and being very careful with breaching human rights laws, but it's difficult. I mean, I always say, how can I reason with somebody that is coming to kill me, and I try to talk to him like it's we should have equal opportunities, equal weapons, or equal methodology, or equal brain coding.
Yes.
So what's your take on that?
Well, my basic point here would be UN has to be rather attentive to the question of legitimacy of state power. Legitimacy is fundamental here. And that legitimacy can be created in various ways. Of course, in the most normal circumstances, you will say elections and governments change and everything is done in an orderly and legitimate fashion. But sometimes things get more complicated. Upheavals happen for various reasons, including for bad governance, but also for real economic reasons or social reasons. And let us not forget, I mean, much of the upheaval in 2011 in the Arab world had to do with social issues, not so much with political issues. There were political issues also, and the beginning was really existential. The Tunisian revolt had to do with the social issues more than with political issues. Now, I don't want to give any judgment. I just want to point out that there is a variety of reasons why upheavals happen, and that in this time of upheaval, one has to look to the question of what does produce legitimacy of state power, because you need a legitimate state in order to provide the necessary order and progress towards better respect of human rights. You are not achieving this objective by being critical without reflection. Criticism may be necessary, but fundamentally it is important to figure out whether a process within a country leads to a higher degree of legitimacy of state, and therefore to a kind of a state structure that would then be a partner for improvement of human rights. And I think that the situation in Egypt has demonstrated that. Obviously, there was an upheaval, there was a transitional period which could produce different constitutional framework, but it was up to the actors in Egypt to define, for example, the sequence of elections. Should the president be elected first and parliament next? Should constitution be approved in a different process in order to give a different framework for legitimacy of state? All that could be discussed. But the important thing is that we respect the will of the people in the way it is expressed. And in Egypt, it was expressed several times. This was a painful and difficult and dangerous search. Yes. And it ended with something that exists today, with a new constitution, with an elected president, with a political atmosphere which shows that a very good level of legitimacy has been achieved. So let's work with this. And for the UN, that's important because UN has to work with member states. And member states vitally depend on the legitimacy they themselves create. So this is my basic approach. And of course, one also has to be aware of the magnitude of problems in Egypt. It's not easy to manage a country of this size, economic problems. It's very important to understand Egypt as a pivotal state of the Middle East region. Things which may go wrong in Egypt may have huge repercussions throughout the region and globally. So one has to factor in all these aspects. And the core question here again, is legitimacy of state, which exists in Egypt and which gives us a platform on which we work with the government and try to help to the extent we can.
How do you see Egypt now and 2 years from now?
Well, I hope. I mean, I'm not familiar with all the details, but I was very impressed by the reconstruction of Suez Canal. For example, this demonstrated a huge amount of will of the people. Yes. This was financed through the people.
64 billion Egyptian pounds. People gathered in 8 days, I believe.
Yeah. You see, this shows two things. This shows that the will of the people to improve the condition of the country clearly is there. It's not that forces of disintegration are gaining. No, I mean, it shows that forces of integration and national unity are very strong. And secondly, it showed that there are ideas about how to modernize the country. I understand also that there are these projects of different economic zones in Egypt, which would give an additional economic opportunity, and so forth. So what I can see is developments in Egypt which promise progress, and that should be supported. internationally. And with some degree of luck, I think Egypt can then be a country that leads the Middle East. I mean, let us think, the Middle East will need local leadership, local in the sense of being indigenous leadership. And Egypt has traditionally had that role. Now the situation has become much more complicated, but at the end of this, it will be again, I think, Egypt as a pivotal state of the region, one that leads the positive developments in the region in the future. Now, that's my, you asked me the question,
yes,
and I give you the answer of how I visualize the future.
Yes. I feel that the UN in the current time and in the next few years, I really feel that we should focus more on peace in the world. I mean, it's the 21st century, and we still hear about people beheaded and burned alive and buried in groups and killed in groups. I mean, are we going barbaric again?
Yeah.
How did that come about? Is it still the language of and the word of the weapon is still the master in the world, or can we just try to reconstruct the world and say, instead of fighting with weapons, why don't we fight in theories and research and bring great things to help humanity? How can we reach that?
Well, first of all, when I was asked in the hearings, the informal dialogue with the candidates, one of the questions was, what is the purpose of the UN? There is a lot of talk about. It's a very good
question.
Yeah, and I said very simply.
I really like the question.
Yeah, I said, look, the purpose of UN is peace. Now, this may look very simplistic, but it's really fundamental, because without peace, you don't have human rights, you don't have progress, you don't have legitimacy of state. I mean, you have to do something to secure peace. And of course, it's a complicated agenda and would require a lot of talk to figure out what exactly are the priority tasks in ensuring peace globally. But there is no doubt about the primacy of peace. Countries which have prospered in the past decades have been all countries at peace. Countries which have not prospered have been exposed to internal disintegration and conflict. And this is not a new phenomenon. One of the things that I have done in my many years of the United Nations was reading the material of United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, UNRISD, which is based in Geneva and brings together social scientists from different parts of the world. And they were starting in 1980s with warnings that what they see in social development in most of the world is a decrease of authority and a fear of disintegration, social disintegration. In 1995, at the World Social Summit in Copenhagen, it was generally agreed that social disintegration is the most explosive phenomenon endangering peace.
Yes.
And there was a kind of a whole series of recommendations of how to go about this problem. Some countries understood that, and
I think a lot of countries didn't understand, because that's what we're reaping right now.
Exactly.
We're harvesting what was planted years back, and now we have a problem.
A much larger problem and much more security-based problem. Yeah. It could have been avoided in many places, not necessarily in all places of the world, but it could have been avoided if the warnings were taken more seriously and the recommendations that the United Nations has produced back 20 years ago were heeded, but they were not. Now very few people understood or remember that there was a global summit on social development in 95, and that it actually did take seriously all these questions, which have then brought further problems and finally produced threats to the peace.
But it was not really followed up seriously with the large amount of states?
Not really. And the UN, of course, doesn't have a means to coerce anybody. UN can be a wise advisor.
You have able to sanction the countries that...
Sure, but that comes at the stage when things are already very bad. One needs to do things much earlier. And obviously, the recommendations are there, but the decisions belong to the government. Take, for example, the Millennium Development Goals of the year 2000. They are seen as success, but they are seen as success because in some very populous countries, there has been a good progress, like China, India, and some other places. The results were not even globally. And I think that underscores the importance of national governments and, again, legitimacy of state power. The states are more accepted by the people, they are more supported by the people if they are seen as legitimate and if they have results in the area of development. And this has been different in different parts of the world. So I think that talking about sanctions and such mechanisms always shows that we are very late in the process, and that sanctions, although they may be necessary, do not show, they do not lead or do not automatically create improvement. Sanctions are a reaction to a very bad situation, not an instrument that will automatically improve the situation.
I would like to know, God willing, when you come into the General Secretary of the UN, what would you be able to provide to the UN?
Well, this is, of course, a very big one. No, I would have to do several things. I mean, I would have to improve the bureaucracy. I mean, we are now in a situation where we have to do certain things at the personnel level. I mean, this may look very bureaucratic, but it is necessary if you want to have the UN as an effective instrument. Better systems of recruitment, better systems of rotation, replacement of people who are going to retire in the next year. So these are very important tasks for the Secretary General, who is the Chief Administrative Officer of the United Nations. But of course, the fundamental question is peace. The purpose of the United Nations is peace. And the Secretary General has to make a contribution with regard to most difficult crisis situations. One of them is clearly Syria. There has to be a stronger role for the UN in that regard. I would have to define the role of the Secretary General in this context. There have been some excellent...
I'm afraid it's a little too late in Syria, but it's better late than never.
Well, look, it is necessary. Every war ends at some point. And the question is, how is the state of Syria going to be constructed at the end of the war? Again, we are with the issues of legitimacy. We have seen in Lebanon how a long war, which lasted 15 years, ended with an agreement, the Taif Agreement, which actually offered a constitutional framework which was not very different from what Lebanon had historically, but was necessary to establish peace and relatively good level of legitimacy. I know that there are critics who say, well, it should have been different, and we can go into this on another occasion. But, you know, thinking about peace in Syria is not impossible, and it is also very necessary. There has to be an idea of the political framework for the future, and the Secretary General will have to have a stronger role in that regard. Obviously, the most immediate tasks are very fundamental and very dramatic, stopping violence and bringing humanitarian assistance in Aleppo, for example, with the short-term ceasefires which are now being negotiated. But that's far from sufficient. There needs to be a political solution, and one has to think and provide formula for that, helping the parties to come to an agreement. Again, don't take me as somebody who is naive. Take me as somebody who is thinking about this very seriously. And I would engage in this sort of questions, irrespective of how impossible they may look at present.
Mr. President, from your perspective, what is the most danger that the world is facing nowadays?
Well, again, social disintegration, social pathology, and I consider terrorism as the most brutal consequence of this disintegration and pathologies that go with that. The question of conflicts between states has been reduced since the ending of the Cold War. But instead of that, the world has seen disintegration of states and violence of a different kind. There were fewer large battle-related deaths now than in the past. Even in the last few years, that numbers were not as high as they were during Cold War. Let us not think about Cold War as a peaceful era. It was an era of controlled military conflicts with large numbers of battle deaths.
Yes.
Now this has changed, and of course the way of dealing with issues of peace is different, and it has to do with social disintegration much more than with interstate tensions. So this is where I think the most needed new solutions are to be sought. And I think our conversation has illustrated several aspects of the problem.
Well, Mr. President, thank you very much for your time. Good luck with the nomination, and promise, if you can promise American Pulse, to have the honor for another interview once you are the Secretary General of the UN. That would be great.
Clearly, I can easily make this promise. I would be very happy to have another conversation. We may perhaps follow up on things that we have opened today. But of course, this would require first that I'm appointed, and there is still a way to go.
Good luck, and we strongly feel that you're the man for the position.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your nice words.
Thank you.